Now, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're so excited to have so many people here to, participate in this conversation about UN Women. Just some brief introductions. My name is Maria Savel. I'm a project manager here at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in New York City. Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung is a German political foundation. Our office opened in New York in 2012, and we're focused on sort of civic education. And we have two main streams of work. One, sort of building international solidarity between leftist groups in North America and Europe. And then also our UN work, where we're really involved in sort of amplifying voices from the global South at the United Nations, among other things. So I wanted to talk a bit, some housekeeping rules, I apologize. If you could please introduce yourselves and your organization in the chat box, and feel free to put any questions either in the chat box or in the Q&A box that's down below. So just a bit about why we're here today to kind of talk about this question: is UN Women a platform worth engaging? So we come after today, the close of CSW was last week. And it was the first in-person CSW since 2019. The one in 2020 was canceled at the last minute. So it feels like an appropriate moment to take a look at UN Women, what it does, who it serves. And it's been an interesting few years for UN Women. I'm kind of speaking most notably about the Memorandum of Understanding with BlackRock. And several years before that, there was the partnership with Uber, both of which caused massive public outcry. And UN Women was forced to end these partnerships, due mostly because of the organization of civil society calling out UN Women for these partnerships. In a way, this was a really great moment for civil society, showing the power of our collective voices. But it really kind of raised the questions of why was a partnership with BlackRock even considered in the first place? So those are just sort of some of the questions we're thinking that led us to really ask, like, who is UN Women? Who does it serve? And who is it for? So to kind of start to answer some of these questions, we have a really fantastic panel of speakers today. And I'll start first with Ritty Lukose. She is an associate professor at the NYU Gallatin School of Individualized Study, where she currently teaches Race and Caste, a Conversation, and Thinking Sex Gender Globally. She has an academic background in anthropology and is interested in the relationship between Western, global, and non-Western feminisms and colonial, post-colonial, and diasporic modernities as they impact South Asia. She is a Fulbright scholar and has received research funding from the American Institute of Indian Studies, the Spencer Foundation, and the National Academy of Education. She has published numerous works, including her book on the liberalization's children, gender, youth, and consumer citizenship in India, and co-editing the book South Asian Feminism, among many other articles and book chapters. So thank you so much for being here. We also have with us today Quiteria Franco. She is a human rights defender, the coordinator of Unión Afirmativa since 2014, which is a non-profit civil association that defends the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and intersex people of Venezuela. She has worked as an English professor at the Simón Bolívar University for over 20 years, and she became a member of the Civil Society Advisory Group at UN Women Latin America and the Caribbean in 2018, working on issues related to human rights, gender, and diversity. She has done extensive research on LGBTI plus rights in Venezuela and has written about discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression in the media, at universities and health services, in the military and police forces, and in prison and private institutions, as well as research on hate crimes and violence, human trafficking and modern slavery of LGBT plus people, LGBT plus forced migration in Venezuela, and other human rights issues in general. She has an extensive experience in media training and working with journalists and broadcasters, and her background in queer activism includes working for Acción Solidaria, an organization working to protect people with HIV and end discrimination and stigma around HIV and AIDS, Acción Cuidanda contra el SIDA, a community organization that develops effective strategies for the protection and promotion of the human rights of people with HIV/AIDS in Venezuela, among many other things. So thank you for being here. And finally, we have Foteini Papagioti, a senior global policy advisor for the International Center for Research on Women, ICRW, where she is responsible for conducting research and analysis and providing evidence-based strategic guidance to governments and international organizations. She has a focus on feminist foreign policy and global gender architecture. She has numerous publications, including the 2022 Feminist UN Campaign Report Card on the Secretary General, the research report, Gender-Sensitive Provisions in Peace Agreements and Women's Political and Economic Inclusion Post-Conflicts, and many other articles about UN and gender. And recently, the Feminist Foreign Policy Index, which assesses countries' progress towards a feminist foreign policy, which was released 2 weeks ago. She's also a part of the Women's Major Group, an organization with the responsibility to facilitate women's civil society, active participation, information sharing, and input into the policy space provided by the United Nations. She does many, many other things regarding UN Women and UN and multilateralism and feminist stuff. So I will start to get into it. We were talking kind of internally about how to start this conversation. And I have to give an immense amount of credit to my colleague, Serena Taylor, who was was entirely the impetus for this event and this conversation. In the lead up to CSW, she was asking some of these basic conversations of what is UN Women and what does it do? And is it actually representing all women? And I thought that these were some really good questions and deserved to have a real conversation. So thank you, Serena, for being the reason we're here today. But to sort of kick off this conversation with our wonderful panel, I wanted to ask, what is UN Women? What, in your experience, panelists, has UN Women been to you? Who do they cater to? I'll start with you, Foteini. You wrote in your report on the SG 5 years after the feminist campaign that the scope and influence of UN Women remains unknown to outside observers. So what is it in what is your perception of UN Women and the work it does based on kind of your research and firsthand experience with the organization?
Thank you, Maria, for the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you all today. Let me clarify that the remark on the scope of influence of UN Women was with regards to the executive committee within the UN, but I do feel that this is to some extent indicative of the overall role and influence of UN Women in the UN system and the multilateral engagement space, which we're going to talk about today. My remarks will draw from ICRW's work on the Feminist UN campaign and the reports we have published to evaluate primarily the Secretary General's commitments to promoting gender equality in the UN system, but with a focus on the role of UN Women within that broader system. So as you may know, UN Women operates on the so-called triple mandate, which encompasses normative support, UN system coordination, and operational activities in country. That means that UN Women supports the international political negotiations and formulates the globally agreed standards for gender equality. UN Women also helps member states to implement those standards through the provision of financial and technical support, and assists other parts of the UN system to promote gender equality within the context of human rights and human development. So overall, I find that the role and the work of UN Women is very much necessary in the UN system and the wider multilateral system, because setting the standards through that political negotiation, promoting them across a wide range of partners, member states, other UN entities, and then monitoring their implementation is a critical normative and accountability process. Although we do know, admittedly, this process can be halting or inconsistent. The standards sometimes perhaps are not as ambitious as we as civil society would have liked. But the role that UN Women plays in the system remains critical. One key issue that we have seen emerge from our reports over the years, and I feel that this should be a priority area for UN Women to think about more deeply and work on more in the future, is a somewhat fraying relationship with civil society. And let's not forget that civil society were the original advocates for the establishment of an entity dedicated to gender equality within the UN system from the very beginning. So we have been noting this increasing lack of transparency with regard to a number of processes. And let me briefly outline some of them, starting with the selection of the latest executive director, which failed to incorporate civil society input into the terms of reference for the position. There was very limited public information on the process, including about shortlisted candidates or the selection panel, which we know included a civil society representative, but their identity was not publicly disclosed, and thus there was no meaningful engagement that was enabled through the process. There's also another issue that we have highlighted was the mandate, terms of reference, and activities of the high-level task force on financing for gender equality, which is co-chaired by UN Women. We have heard in 2021 that the HLTF is working on harmonizing gender markers for the UN system, but there has been no further information forthcoming, and it is not clear whether this task force is intended to increase funding for gender equality across the system, or it is more a normative role. This also remains unclear. There is also an ongoing gender architecture review, which I find was a missed opportunity to have a feminist partner undertake it. And there has also been speculation around the future role of UN Women in the context of this review. But again, we have no further information on the process or the preliminary report that has been completed. You mentioned, Maria, the partnership with BlackRock, and which raises the wider issue of a lack of civil society engagement and input to UN Women's relationships with the private sector. And then finally, the work of the LGBTIQ+ policy specialist. We know this position was appointed in 2020, but there has been no further information on what this role entails and what the objectives and goals of the position are. But we do find this to be a critical role within UN Women, especially at this time where even the basic rights of women, girls, and LGBTIQ individuals and communities are under attack at each negotiation. So I think in line with the Secretary General's commitments in the Our Common Agenda report, a trust-based, collaborative, and transparent engagement with feminist organizations should be a priority for UN Women, and that could enhance outcomes for gender equality and push for more ambitious change across all aspects of the triple normative, operational, and coordination mandate. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think you raised some really interesting points that we can get into a little bit later as well. I'll move now to Ritty. So I want to just ask that with your academic background in the relationship between Western, global, and non-Western feminisms, how does UN Women incorporate these different streams of feminism?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me. And I feel like I should begin by saying that I am very much outside of the UN system. I'm a scholar, and I think it might be helpful to understand how I came to be interested in the UN system. And that might offer a kind of window into the different ways in which I understand different kinds of feminisms as they circulate inside and outside the UN system. I pretty much, when I was co-editing this book on South Asian feminisms, the large question of that book was sort of how differently located feminist movements and organizations in the region of South Asia were being impacted by local, national, international, global reconfigurations. And in doing that project, it became very clear that in different countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, there was a lot of vexed kind of wrestling with the ways in which, particularly starting in the 90s, I would say, there was a kind of mainstreaming of gender, which I think is the flip side of what you were just talking about, meaning that there was a kind of gender mainstreaming, the powerful circulation of ideas of gender empowerment and so on, that seemed to be coming from international aid agencies, funding sources, the kind of larger global infrastructure of gender, I would say, and that was having there were possibilities in that, and there were also limitations in that, and a sense of the ways in which those links and alignments across scale were reshaping things on the ground in ways that were sometimes positive, but also negative, or at least limiting. And in that context, I became very interested in the fact that, and it would lead to very divisive kinds of debates about co-optation and so on. And in that context, I became very interested in the fact that it felt like there were earlier histories in which saying international or saying global or saying transnational was not a dirty word, that there were other moments. And I felt like the 90s debate was not recognizing how the ground had shifted, and different organizations and groups were positioned on that ground without really understanding that the world had changed such that ideas like the international or links across scale mean different things. And that, something like the end of the Cold War, 1989, the kind of euphoria post end of the Cold War about capitalism and how the West had won and so on and so forth, reshaped how people debated and thought about feminism and gender, equality and justice and so on. And so I became interested in earlier histories, like the 1970s, for example, where, what constituted feminism and what definition, what constitutes a woman's issue was up for grabs. And it was up for grabs between sort of feminists coming out of the Soviet system, across East-West, across North-South, where a kind of American liberal feminism had to contend with many other forces and voices about what constituted this term, and that there was a real struggle about whether it was just formal equality or whether one was interested in economic and social issues, more deeper ideas of substantive equality, etc. And it became productive for me to recognize that the international context from the get-go was shaped by many different geographies and many different ideologies about women's issues. So, and there's interesting scholarship that I think points to some of this. So Kristen Godsey's work on Eastern European women and their struggles with American women, the important role of social democratic feminism coming from the Scandinavian countries, Southern feminists. I'm very interested in Southern feminists who were bringing a third worldist, non-aligned movement kind of perspective to the international arena. Catherine Marino's book on Pan-American feminism as really articulating some of the founding ideas about gender equality that made its way into the UN Declaration and so on. And so I came to understand, quite apart from the kind of narrow space in which people were debating these things in the 90s, that the international was a very robust space inside and outside of the UN, where a cacophony of different voices were coming to the table. And so I'm kind of interested in remembering that and hoping that that has some impact on the ways in which we think about these questions today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think, just a little background of like bringing together this panel. We really wanted like these diverse perspectives, from South Asia, and then we can move over to South America as well. It's part of the question of who does UN women serve? Especially in feminist spaces, white feminists can often be found to sort of dominate these conversations. So I think it's really interesting to bring up these, diverse feminist perspectives and kind of think about sort of, some of this stuff that you were speaking on, Ritty. It's really important to keep that in mind as we continue this conversation. And so now I'll move on to Quiteria. And you have some direct experience working with UN women on the ground in Venezuela. So I really want to ask a bit about that experience and, ask you what does UN Women do on a regional level, and how has your interaction been with UN Women as a CSO representative?
Aha. Right. I'm sorry. I was just trying to see how to mute myself. Well, I have to say, I joined the advisory group of civil society in UN Women for Latin America and the Caribbean in the beginning of 2018. I decided to apply for the position when they called, because we do not have, as most countries in the region, a UN women office in Venezuela. So I thought it was an opportunity to try to go and talk about lesbian women and bisexual women, trans women. It took me a while to understand UN Women, how it works and what it actually does. And now that you're asking me again, I don't think I can give you a clear answer. It took me a while, and what I can tell you is the experience that I had. The first year and a half, UN Women for the Caribbean and Latin America was directed by Luisa Carvalho. And then in the middle of July 2019, there was a change of direction to the current director, Maria Noel Baeza. So I saw the change in the managerial styles. I cannot say whether my experience has been positive or negative. It has been a very interesting experience. And I think there is a lot to do within UN Women. And when we criticize, we do it in the most positive way to promote positive changes. I do think, and I agree with Foteini, who said that there's need for more engagement between UN Women and civil society. One of the positive outcomes I can say in advocating for lesbian women is that the first year I was able to, and I consider that I was involved in this, there was a change in social media of UN Women. They started writing and sharing messages about lesbian women, bisexual women, not so much about trans women, but there was a change. And I want to believe I had something to do with that. There was also one of the things I suggested to start celebrating as part of the agenda, the calendar, official calendar, April 26th, which is Lesbian Visibility Day. So that started in the region, and also in UN Women Central. At least in social media, I saw that change. Now, it was different when we were in the conferences. I noticed that it was very difficult to engage with the rest of the feminist organizations that already have a lot of experience, that they've had some time already working with UN. So getting into that group was very difficult. And also, I noticed that we could probably go later to that, a very strong influence of ideology in the way advocacy for gender equality was made, which is not my experience. But, I was basically trying to do the best I could. And I did notice there was a problem when we were in conferences, for example, especially the small ones for the advisory group, when we, language was a big issue. We had most of people speak Spanish, but then we had also people from Brazil who speak Portuguese. And we also have representative from the Caribbean, English-speaking countries. So sometimes UN Women would complain that they didn't have money to pay for interpreters. So that created a huge problem of communication. And it took sometimes too long to agree on a subject because of these language differences. It may not seem important, but it is. And with time, the position for advisory in each advisory group is supposed to be 2 years, maximum 3 years. I'm still part of the advisory group because at some point, meetings were less and less, and our role was not to advise, but simply to validate what UN Women was doing. So that totally deviated the purpose of the advisory group, which, in my opinion, well, it doesn't make sense anymore to be part of the advisory groups. So I've called on this several times. I've already complained. I've already said, listen, we have to take our role again, seriously. Our role here is to advise, and that's not what we're doing. So these are the issues I can share with you for the moment. If we have time, and we can probably answer questions from the public later. So that has been more or less my experience as part of the advisory group. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. I want to get into a little bit more in depth on sort of UN Women's relationship with marginalized communities. So I'll come back to you, Ritty. I know you said you don't have a lot of hands-on work, but I think I would love to ask you about your knowledge and expertise on South Asian feminism and how you could see, how would you like to see like these streams of South Asian feminism like integrated into UN Women and other lateral organizations as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important and interesting to recognize that different kinds of women's movements in South Asia are complex formations in and of themselves. And so, oftentimes shaped by the hierarchies of their own societies. And that in turn shapes, in some sense, which voices from those movements circulate internationally through the UN system and so on. And so I think that's important to recognize on the one hand, but I would also, despite my sort of earlier kind of somewhat skeptical or critical take on, debates about mainstreaming and co-optation and so on, I think it's also important to recognize that these these links to the UN infrastructure, and I'm using that maybe a little bit more broadly than just UN Women. I'm thinking about international NGOs. I'm thinking about the funding sources that circulate across them, and so on and so forth. Have created particular spaces within South Asia for the articulation of new concerns. And so, for example, in the 1990s in India, I would say that the question of sexuality, both in terms of sexual minority rights, as well as, say, the articulation of sex worker movements, right, really had very little place within the Indian women's movement, right? And it was partly the unintended consequences of the kind of AIDS crisis and money flowing through in terms of AIDS prevention and so on, that created new contexts within which groups took that funding and found different ways of articulating politics that far exceeded maybe what those were intended for. And so it led to the emergence of something that has greatly enriched the women's movement in India, I would say, which is trans rights, sexual minority rights, sex worker unionization, and sex worker activism, which is very strong in India and an important voice internationally, et cetera. So I think that every historical moment and context creates new opportunities and new pitfalls. And both within those movements, each has debated what the links are between what's going on the ground in terms of activism and the links to the international. But it's a complicated and interesting set of issues that owes much to international connections. And I think you can, countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan are far like a country like Bangladesh, having international links through NGOs is far less controversial than it is in India, partly because of the different histories of the Indian state and the Bangladeshi state and so on. But as I said earlier, it's both enabling and constraining in different kinds of ways.
Thank you so much for that. And then back to you, Quiteria. Since you work as a coordinator for Union Afirmativa and your work as, an LGBT plus activist, what is your perception of how UN Women has included queer rights and the intersection with race, class, and ability in its work? And sort of what major concerns do you have for your community, and how could you see these being addressed by UN Women?
My first experience, but I think there's not a clear understanding of the needs of the whole queer movement, and especially lesbian women, bisexual women, and even less about trans women. So I could probably tell you the first experience I had, the first conference I attended. I noticed that whenever we were discussing on the topic, first the topics of the year are selected by somebody else, not necessarily consulted with civil society, and then organizations just simply contribute with information. So the first group I met, the first group of colleagues in the advisor group, I noticed there were 2 lesbian women and there were 2 bisexual women. But whenever we were discussing the topics and within the conference, none of them raised those issues about sexual orientation. So at some point during the breaks, I had the courage to ask why that was happening. And some of them said it was more comfortable for them to advocate for other rights, not necessarily related to sexual orientation. So that made me think that UN Women and those spaces in the conference were not safe enough for lesbian women and bisexual women to raise issues related to them. And that made me wonder if that was a real space worth engaging, as the question raised for this forum posts. So I said, this is what we do, this advocating work that we do. It's a long-term work. So we have to insist, we have to persist, and we have to raise our voice. If we give up and then we adopt this position that these women had, then we're never gonna achieve our goals. So that's why I decided to stay. And I think there are two ways in which we can try to include certain topics. And this concerning two of the issues you mentioned, Black women and lesbian women. As part of this new advisory group I was in, there was a Colombian woman who advocated for Black women, and in my case, advocating for lesbian and bisexual women. So I can say that because we found people there really interested or real allies, we managed to include certain sentences, very short sentences, that at least mention these two issues. But it took a long time, and it took a lot of conversation, and it took a lot of convincing. So that is my experience. Yes, it is possible, but it requires a lot of persistence, a lot of being there and raising your voice and getting the courage and finding allies, aware of the needs, and also who are part of the population you defend and are not afraid to come out and be visible. Like in the case I was telling you of these women, they have been there for 2 years and they never raised the topic. So it takes courage and to find real allies within UN women. That is what I can say.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And this wasn't on the program, but Foteini, I want to ask your sort of thoughts of, kind of working with UN Women in New York. Sort of how inclusive do you find UN Women to be, both in terms of representing like all types of women, lesbian, queer, trans, but also these different streams of feminism, and from the global South, from the global North, all, just kind of your thoughts on the overall inclusivity of the organization.
Thank you, Maria. My experience in this sense would be shaped by the work we have done looking at gender parity within the broader UN system. And a key issue that some of the staff members in the UN and in UN Women in particular have raised, which I think ties to the discussion we're having regarding which feminisms and which women, is that there are certain patterns in the selection, recruitment, retention, progression of women in the UN system that highlight patterns that are regional patterns, and also tie to overall member state funding for UN entities and UN Women in particular, which means that, there may be a tendency, it may be easier for white women whose native language is English to advance in the system. There have been patterns also revealed by data on the selection and senior leadership appointments, revealing that it is again easier for white women to progress in the system. But it's also worth remembering that the system is made up of many individuals, and there has been a lot of thought going into how do these patterns then, how can they be addressed and how can they be changed to be more inclusive, more intersectional, and more representative. And there is a lot of work happening across the system and in UN Women specifically toward that end. Again, the UN, as Quiteria mentioned, can be slow, can be complex. It is a big organization, and it is not easy to immediately see the impact of changes like that. But I do feel that, again, with strong engagement with civil society, and again, as Quiteria so well, from firsthand experience shared it, you need the courage and you need the long-term engagement, investment, and continuous advocacy to bring those issues to the forefront. And there will always be people within the UN and UN Women in particular willing to listen and take those changes forward. So I think there is an opportunity there for us to continue pushing for those issues to be addressed and represented.
Thank you for sharing that. I see that people have been putting some questions in the Q&A box. Thank you. Please continue to do so. We'll get to those in a little bit. We just have a few more sort of questions to get through. Kind of thinking about the future of UN Women and possible alternatives, both inside and outside of UN structures. I'm going to ask you, Ritty, some international law scholars are arguing that the structure of the UN itself protects a colonial foundation. Sort of what are alternative spaces for left movements to work in as alternatives to a colonial UN structure?
Yeah. Well, I would like to say that I think the UN system is a complicated system that emerges out of obviously the kind of moment of the ends of imperialism, formal imperialism on a world scale, but it was also in many ways shaped by the energies of the decolonizing world. And I think that that's important to keep in mind in order to not throw out the baby with the bathwater. And so to me, thinking about the hopes that people had within what we now call the global South in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, about what a new international order could look like. I think it's important to recognize that those projects and those visions in some sense were defeated. I think we don't spend enough time on that defeat. But I also feel like there were hopes that people had coming in and through anti-colonial left, anti-imperialist orientations, where feminists who were marginalized in their own states, we have to recognize that that's where a lot of the turn to the international is coming from feminists in the third world, that there was hope there. And I think it's important to keep that in mind to fuel a kind of attempt at reorienting things. I was thinking about Quiteria, you talking about, the work it takes to change a little phrase in some policy document. And I'm thinking back to the Pan-American feminist or Hansa Mehta, who literally argued about whether the Article 1 of the UN Declaration should say all men are created equal or all human beings are created equal, and how that was a huge battle. And when we look back on it, generations later, that was an important battle to win, right? And so I think it's important to remember those things. I also think that it is important to recognize that there were other forms of feminist internationalism that were not tied to the interstate system that we should also draw on to fuel engagement, and I think that there are lots of grassroots movements. I'm thinking about Veronica Gago's book on the Feminist International coming out of what's going on in Argentina and Latin America. I think there are, I mean, we've seen the women's marches, we've seen, you know, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of grassroots energy now on the ground in different parts of the world, linking economic issues, sexuality issues, et cetera. And I think, you know, one has to remember the earlier histories of those kinds of connections and across different kinds of mobilizations, as well as, you know, the articulation of the women's strike and so on. And I think that that's important to decenter, in some sense, a singular UN focus, but also to re-energize how one goes about engaging that space, because that did happen in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s.
Thank you for that. I think it's good to sort of remind ourselves of the positive and some of these. It's very easy to become disillusioned, I think. So these, you know, to remind us of like some of the origins of all of this is really important as we think about the future. So I'll switch now to Quiteria. You know, as a member of the CSO advisory group, you know, how can we make these structures work for us? You've talked a bit about this, but if you could expand a bit more about how left movements can really use these spaces to advocate for their needs without falling victim to the status quo or sort of being absorbed by these massive, hard to kind of move UN processes.
Well, I will repeat what I said before. We have to be patient, we have to persevere, and we have to have our goals clear. I have to clarify, first of all, that I see myself as a human rights defender. And I have read a lot about feminism, and I know feminism was before, as a tool, as a way of advocating, was a lot before than human rights per se. But I believe, and as a Venezuelan, living in Venezuela, that the tool for advocating for gender equality and for LGBTI people within UN should be human rights perspective. That has been my training. That has been my education on human rights. And I can explain to you why. The last 23 years, living in Venezuela, in a self-identified socialist and left-wing government, we have seen how women and LGBTI people have been left behind, especially after the complex humanitarian emergency that we are living since 2016 approximately. We have seen women and LGBTI people most affected by this crisis because the pre-existing conditions of exclusion, discrimination was aggravated by this crisis. And the response from South American countries, and especially from left movements, have been far from solidarity. And what has happened is that Venezuela and human rights movements from Venezuela have been isolated. And there has been this left movement automatic pact not to criticize Venezuela just because the government has self-identified as a left-wing government, as a socialist movement, and as a feminist government, when in reality, women have been severely affected by the crisis. So I believe, and that's why I insist, that the advocacy we do should have a human rights perspective, because what has happened is that there's been this gap, this separation between what we do in Venezuela and the support we need as society. And what has prevailed is the support to a government just because it's from the left wing, just because they self-identify, when in reality, it is not. We do not have rights. Our conditions have aggravated. And personally, I have been witness of this, what I'm telling you. And since I like sharing examples, that first conference that I attended in 2018, it was in Argentina. I remember that very clearly. There was this discussion about the draft of the document that was later to be validated in the CSW the following year. So there was a proposal to criticize the violence and the government in Nicaragua. And I was there. And we in Venezuela had a worse situation than in Nicaragua. So I raised my hand and I said, listen, if there is this proposal to include Nicaragua and the criticism to what is happening there, then Venezuela should be included because our situation is a lot worse. And it has been going on for a long time. The result of my proposal was that the general opinion was not to mention Nicaragua, so they wouldn't have to mention Venezuela, as I suggested. So this left-wing solidarity has been affecting us severely. So that's why I think that if we want to continue advocating in UN Women, the perspective has to change. Everybody's free to, advocate with their ideology, but I think it should be with the human rights perspective, and this is exactly what we should demand. Directors, regional directors, and the general director of UN Women, because this is affecting us in our lives, in our everyday life, and this separation and this battle between who is in the right wing, who's in the left wing. I hope that my message is getting across clearly, and this is my recommendation and the answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you make some really interesting points that we could have an entire other panel discussion about. But I have a couple more questions, but I think it'd be great to answer some of the Q&As that we got in the box. So I think there's some questions about sort of overall meeting the needs of like all types of women. Somebody specifically mentions about how older women can be included in this work, but then also beyond that, rural women. And I would also kind of ask about Indigenous women, which is a lot of the work we do at UN, here at RLS with our work with the UN. So I don't know if anybody in the group would like to kind of specifically talk about these other types of marginalized groups and how they are, treated by the system, or how they can advocate within the system.
Rural women, I can just say from my experience, what I've seen during 2 consecutive years, the main topic of the CSW, which is obviously supported by UN Women, was about rural women. And there was also some other population, workers, sex workers. At some point, there was some inclusion of sex workers also, and Indigenous women. So these 2 also marginalized population are taken into consideration by UN Women. That I can say, because it was the main focus, the main topic of 2 consecutive years during the declaration that we draft. Thank you. Anybody else have anything to add on that? No.
And then I'll move to a question we got from my colleague Tatet, who talked about pinkwashing as a real and present threat, given the recent history of UN Women. How do you see feminist movements and civil society in general guarding against this? I think I'll pass this over to you, Foteini, first.
Thank you. I think the recent case of the BlackRock partnership is a very good example of this. You know, as feminists, we have a lot on our plates, and sometimes our attention may tend to shift elsewhere. But I think this was a very clear case of where it was immediately clear to many feminists and organizations that this is an issue that we need to tackle immediately, and, you know, put all our efforts into this. And I think the success with, you know, organizing around it in a very short time, drafting the language, the open letter, the call, the advocacy, and then having the result that we wanted to have, basically, at least in the sense that the partnership did not go through, although it is not clear yet if there are further steps taken to kind of shape a framework for private sector engagement more broadly. This is not, we don't have a lot of information on that yet. But I think that this is a good example of when we work together and we collectively shape the language and the advocacy, we do get the results that we want to see. That perhaps is an opportunity for us as feminist organizations and feminists to think more deeply about how do we want to sustain that engagement? What change do we want to see? Let's be clearer in our articulation of what kind of change do we want to see from UN Women, and then what actions and strategies can we use to push for that change. So just as we call on UN Women to rethink their frameworks and their approaches, we can also perhaps work together to shape an inclusive and common vision of what we want UN Women to be doing for us, and how do we step in when we feel that this is not happening and pushing for change. So I think this would be an approach that we can consider taking in the future as well.
Thank you for that. I'll actually ask you about this a bit, Ritty. I mean, not in the necessarily the context of UN Women, but just with your experience in South Asia about, you know, this idea of pinkwashing, and how has that played out, if at all, in some of the context you've done research on?
Yeah, I mean, I you know, the term pinkwashing, I think, draws attention to the ways, you know, draws attention to an important dynamic, which is, I think, very both productive and difficult for feminists, right? Which is the instrumentalization of, say, the use of gender equality or sexual minority rights, et cetera, by powerful governments and entities, and not necessarily in the name of the kind of justice that one is interested in, but in order to do other kinds of things and displace other kinds of processes, right? Whether they be exercise of geopolitical power, et cetera, or when corporations do the same thing, right? Which is to improve their image by sort of talking about defending the human rights of women and so on and so forth, when actually in their policies and so on, they're doing the exact opposite often, right? And I think when it comes to feminist language, when it comes to the language of sexual minority rights, when it comes to the language of human rights, there's a way in which that can be instrumentalized. And I think paying attention to scale, paying attention to who's saying what to whom about what, and what impact that has on actually on the grassroots, on community organizations, and the ways in which those are working, I think is really important. I think that there's in South Asia, for example, in 2018 was the overturning of Section 377, which was the criminalization of homosexuality in a British era penal code. And, it brought together many different kinds of entities. It was a long legal campaign. There were there was a lot going on within the constitutional framework of India, but also appeals to the idea that somehow India needed to become more civilized and so on and so forth, kind of using some kind of neocolonial language, right? And so, I mean, what was striking about the Supreme Court decision was that it very much spoke to constitutional morality within and in relation to the Indian Constitution. It was not some kind of civilizing mission kind of discourse, right? But I think that can easily happen, and it's important for I think from my perspective, for feminists to hold on to a kind of anti-imperialist, kind of anti-capitalist critique in order to engage the misuses of these terms, because I think one of the really complex things for feminism is the ways in which ideas of gender equality grease the wheels of many other projects, right? And we have to be vigilant about that, even right-wing ones.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective. Really appreciate you sharing. Now, a question in the Q&A. This is more directed at you, Quiteria, but I think also Foteini, there might be some space for you to speak on some of this. Cynthia wrote that she has been pushing UN Women to do deeper work on lesbian and LGBTQ women for over 15 years. And as Quiteria has said, it's slow, requires courage and persistence. With that said, the LBT focal point, who was just relocated to Bangkok from NYC to decentralize the work, has been doing so much. But the change within the institution is bureaucratic and slow. There's a webpage planned, which is partially developed, internal country team guidance and training, including with local partners rather than imposing one model. She's asking you, Quiteria, what would you recommend UN Women do? Commitment from the top, or to integrate the focus on LGBTQ women? And what are your top priorities you'd like to see in the immediate future?
Well, that's a great question. We have to sit down and elaborate a plan to give you a full answer. But I have to say that it came to me as a shocking news when Foteini mentioned that there was especially LGBTI specialists at UN Women. I didn't know. I had no idea that existed. So that's how much we need to do at UN Women. And I think the change has to come from within the UN Women. It's also demanded the women who are there and identify as lesbian or Black or Indigenous. We have to question UN also, like how many of your people are from marginalized community? How much space do you give to them? Do you as you demand countries, how much and how do you let people know that working at UN Women, it's safe? They're going to a conference on women, it's safe for you to be and to demand and to express yourself. I just gave you an example of how lesbian women there did not feel safe enough as to talk about sexual orientation issues. So we have to question that. And we also, to avoid this pink washing we've been talking about, is to ask for actions. What are we exactly doing? Don't tell me that you're a pro-LGBT. Tell me the actions you're planning. What is your annual plan for incorporating this issue? We also have to take into consideration that because we live in Venezuela, UN Women has to decide which topics to address within a country. So not to do something similar that other UN agency does. That happened in Venezuela. So it also depends on the country on the needs. So it would have to be according to each country's needs. So I cannot say what will be the top priorities, because it varies from country to country. But what I think is that it should be incorporated from UN Women Central and then each agency in the country decides whether it is a priority or not.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to say about some of this, Foteini, because you mentioned the focal point and kind of not being really sure what they're doing now. So kind of on that question, how can the work of like a focal point on LGBT plus issues, be more effective? And does UN Women need other focal points? And how could a role like this actually bring about change and, represent more women?
Thank you. I think I echo what Quiteria said in the sense that country priorities also shape these decisions, but at the same time, the opportunity for UN Women there and the strength perhaps is primarily the normative role. With appropriate expertise, and that is also something we can get into how much of the expertise that we want to see is there and is available. UN Women can develop strong standards in the sense of, agreed language, what kind of commitments we want to see. And that then can shape the response specifically in each of the countries based on the needs that are identified, again, in collaboration with civil society, and can also strengthen the coordination role then within the UN system, where once the standards are established, they can push the system to adhere to those standards as well. Now, how well or to what degree that is happening is very much, again, we don't have the information on that. And I think this is a key area that emerges every time we have these discussions about UN Women and the UN system. It is so hard to get concrete information on activities, objectives, priorities, and that is the role of the focal point. That would be one person, one office, where the engagement is sustained and where we can always go to and have those clear answers and information on what is happening. Because many times our intelligence, let's put it this way, or our information about projects and priorities relies on other feminist and civil society advocates, and that can create confusion, that can spread rumors, that can, this is not a sustainable way of building that relationship. It is, as the participant mentioned in the Q&A, there is a website, it's partly developed. The process can be very slow, very bureaucratic. I mean, that's understandable. Again, it's a complicated and big organization. But we do want that clarity of information, and then it will become much easier for us also to clarify and have a clearer framework in our minds of how do we want to engage and what is the change that we want to see. So that would be my top priority for this area of engagement in the sense of we need clearer and more frequent information and engagement.
Maria, if you let me add something, I also think sometimes that there is not enough communication between UN Women and what is happening at CEDAW, because there are constant resolutions and guidance on how to act on specific population and marginalized women. So I think that sometimes there is not this relationship, there is not a close relationship between what is happening in CEDAW and what UN Women can do to guide actions. So that will be another recommendation for how to start, reducing the gap.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think Betty Levy in the comments has also raised something that we've kind of touched on a bit already, but the shrinking space for CSOs within the UN, but UN women specifically. I'd love to ask you guys about this. I was sort of at CSW, how just getting tickets to the opening ceremony was near impossible for CSOs, and during like the height of the COVID pandemic, that was a valid excuse to sort of like close down UN headquarters and keep civil society out. But it still seems to me that they're finding other reasons to make it very difficult for the CSOs to get access to the UN and do that direct advocacy. So kind of if you guys could like just comment on your experience with that, and how do you think CSOs can push to kind of regain or reclaim some of their voice to better advocate for themselves? I don't know. Foteini, do you want to start?
Sure, I think those are all very valid points. Just the optics of having women from around the world queue up for 4 hours to get their CSW badges in the cold, older women there. It just doesn't look good. And it's hard to think, are there many other such annual big events happening at the UN where people have to queue for hours to get their badges? I must admit, I don't know, but it doesn't look good. There have been repeated calls to have the seat of the CSW rotating to ensure that, as Ritty said, what we now call the Global South can be better represented, that it can be more accessible. These are all issues that need to be taken up and seriously considered in UN Women, but also more broadly at the UN. And the Secretary General in his Our Common Agenda report has outlined some steps and initiatives that can be taken up quickly, has addressed some of these remarks, in comments to member states, also with recommendations on how to resolve these issues. I feel that with the UN more broadly and in general, sometimes, there's a tendency to reward intention rather than actual results, in the meaning that all these ideas and initiatives are articulated and put on paper, but then there is no follow-up, monitoring, and accountability on whether there's any progress made toward those goals. So we don't really know how well these measures are being implemented and if they're having any actual impact on enabling accessibility and inclusivity in these, spaces for us feminists, and particularly from feminists who traditionally have a harder time accessing those spaces.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe Quiteria, you could comment a bit about CSOs trying to reclaim space in UN systems.
Well, what Foteini has described was not different during the 3 years that we had the online events. The platform was not friendly. It was too complicated, and I think it's somehow it would be a lot better if we reduce the number of events, so we would have really a chance to focus on what we're interested in, and again to follow up, because I don't see the benefit of having so many events happening at the same time, and then what do we do with that? And if you make the effort to go there and invest in all the costs, all that it takes to go there, and then you don't see the results, you don't see the attention you require, or you do not think you actually have an impact on an issue that's important to you as an organization or as a woman, then comes the frustration. I have felt frustrated at the CSW. So I think we have to rethink the whole event and give suggestions to how we could change it. I'm just mentioning some. Probably reducing the number of events, and if they are in line to the main topic that is selected. Just one coming out of my head now. Could probably think this better, but just some ideas.
Yeah, thank you for that. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll kind of start some of my final questions to the group. The guiding question of this whole event was, is UN Women a platform worth engaging? And I think we've answered that question, that yes, it is. But I would love to, if we could kind of just go around and get everybody's opinion about, how to phrase this, yes, it is a platform worth engaging, but how can civil society engage with it better? And what changes would you like to see from UN Women to be more representative? And then I think kind of a nice question to sort of end on is, how can our movements work together to support one another to ensure that UN Women takes all of our concerns into account? So I'll start with Ritty. I know you don't directly advocate at UN Women, but I think this question about movements working together and kind of CSOs reclaiming space, if you could speak on that.
Sure. As I was listening to the two of you talk about the role of CSOs, I mean, one of the things that I think is so, ironic in a way is the central role that non-governmental organizations have played in advancing the goals of the UN. I think there was a sense by the late 1960s that somehow simply viewing it as an interstate system and not recognizing the role of civil society organizations was a way of not reaching the people that you are actually interested in reaching, right? And so I think that it's not just a question of access, it's about the crucial role that civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations have played historically in advancing the goals and aims of different kinds of UN agencies, and so I was just thinking about that as I was listening to you, and also recognizing the ongoing struggle of access within a multilateral institution that is fundamentally an interstate system, right? And so that struggle between CSOs and the state within, say, a country like India or Venezuela or any country is always a fraught one. But then also trying to nudge space for oneself within a multilateral interstate system is also just, it's such an important thing to do, because obviously that international arena is important for giving voice to marginalized communities within those states. And to me, in some sense, the women's movement, sexual minority rights movements, and so on are stateless in a certain sense within these different countries and have to maneuver within and outside that context for space. In terms of, how we can support each other, I teach a class, I think you mentioned, called Thinking Sex Gender Globally, and I always have to explain to my students why they need to read all these UN documents week after week, etc. And one of the things I tell them is that, this is an institution that defines agendas and takes up space, and there's a lot of corporate celebrity energy that runs inside and outside as issues of gender equality and so on are articulated, and you have to become engaged but also critical skeptics of such a powerful institution, and that it's important to engage these institutions, developing a critical sensibility about imperialism and capitalism and pinkwashing and all of these things, because I maybe it's partly because I'm teaching in New York, but so many of my students are drawn into this world. And it's important for them to be critical citizens of this world in order to remember other histories, forge other connections, you know. And I do think that there is a lot of grassroots energy among young people that I have felt even in the years that I've been teaching at NYU. And it's important for them to have alternative perspectives. They already have it. I think this is a generation that post-2008 is far more anti-capitalist than pre-2008, et cetera, you know, so yeah, we're catching up to them.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I'll kind of ask a similar question to you, Quiteria, about, you know, ensuring our movements can work together, you know, to support each other and, you know, reclaim that space at UN Women.
Well, adding to what we've been talking about, UN Women is relatively new. Only last year we're celebrating 10 years. And I think change is possible. I'm very optimistic. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in this job as a human rights defender. This requires being persistence, as I said before. And we have to allow ourselves to feel frustrated. But then we get together again and we elaborate, we think of strategies, and we continue our work. I didn't know, for example, Foteini, and I think we have agreed on a lot of things. So you see, now I think I have a partner and somebody I can say, well, let's get together and, you know, draw on a strategy and do this advocacy and try to change the system. And it is possible. We have done it. I mean, only 10 years ago, we didn't have equal marriage. And we have to support each other as women to exercise real sorority. Because sometimes I've heard this word over and over, but in practice, we do not exercise it, you know? So it's just a matter of finding each other in our needs, in our dissatisfaction of the system, and allowing ourselves to feel sad, but then getting again to work and elaborating strategies to change. It is possible. And there was something I read in the comments in the Q&A, and I would like to point that sometimes I have felt that because there is this other seen as something outside the LGBTI movement, and sometimes I have to make peace with myself and said, listen, and I had to say that in UN Women, at the end of the day, yes, I am a lesbian woman, but I'm a woman. Do not think that because my sexual orientation is not part of the majority, I should not be considered a woman. I'm part of this movement. And sometimes we also have to see beyond that. It's like, I might be discriminated because I'm a woman, because of my sexual orientation, because I'm a Black woman, because of my physical appearance. So there are a lot of reasons why I might be discriminated. So we have to be real, exercise this sisterhood that we talk about, and get together and see beyond our particular differences that sometimes separates us. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I wanted to share.
And I guess like the final question, I'll pass it to you, Foteini. You can kind of speak on this as well, but I was thinking with your experience kind of monitoring UN Women here in New York, sort of what are some of like the major successes that you've seen come out of UN Women? And then what are sort of the challenges and the things that you are working for maybe in your advocacy that you want to see change within UN Women?
Thank you. I think CSW this year has been a success. We've come out with great conclusions. I also think, as I said, UN Women does a great job putting out the standards that we want to see. Of course, they may not be 100% representative of all our realities, but this is a critical role that we want to see UN Women continue to play in the system. Challenges that remain, as I mentioned, would be strengthening that relationship. And, you know, in my research, I enjoy critiquing and criticizing the institution, but I also like to think about the individual people making those institutions. And I think the biggest opportunity for us to strengthen that relationship, and that also ties to your question about how do we work together, is to think about the people in the system who are gender advocates as well, because if you want to work for UN Women, I am assuming you're interested in pursuing gender equality and promoting gender equality. So our interests align to a great extent already. They may be caught between, I should say, our advocacy from the outside and the bureaucracy and internal constraints from the system more broadly within. So their position is also something I like to take into consideration when I think about what is my advocacy, what I'm asking those people to do, how do we work together, how do I also support them, and how do I also bring the voices and demands of those who cannot necessarily access these spaces to my advocacy. And that goes back to us working together. And then for myself also, there's a big component of, because as we said, the UN is so huge and complex and very opaque sometimes. If I have spent hours figuring something out that relates to the UN, then it's my job to be, you know, willing and able to share that information more broadly and make it easier for someone who is not necessarily engaging in this space as much to have, you know, that clarity of what those structures are, what the goals are. And I think that plays an important role. And that's also a challenge going beyond the gender space. We're discussing UN Women today, but there are so many other entities across the system where gender is a very low priority, or it's just a tick box exercise. A challenge for us then is to think, how do we leverage the role of UN Women in the system to influence those other processes as well? So I would say we can work together. It's a slow process. It's frustrating, as Quiteria said. But I personally see it as a big opportunity for engagement and to continue to pushing the agenda forward.
Thank you. And I think that's a really kind of great sentiment to wrap things up on. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I thought this was a really fantastic conversation. Thank you, Foteini, Ritty, and Quiteria for being here and sharing your thoughts and expertise. We're immensely grateful for it. And I think you've given us at RLS a lot to kind of think about as we sort of are thinking about our UN work going forward. So thank you, everybody, again. And also, one final amazing thank you to Serena for putting this whole event together and conceptualizing everything. So have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.